A few years ago, in 2003, I rented an apartment from a friend of mine who had recently bought it. He had just renovated the place and put it up for sale, but couldn't find a buyer. So I offered to rent it in the meantime. After moving in, I noticed the neighborhood was quiet, but there was something strange about the lady in the apartment next door. She appeared to be around 45 years old, but looked much older. She spent the whole night listening to loud Christian radio programs and speaking loudly to someone, although she lived alone. It got to the point where I couldn't sleep anymore, so I went to her apartment and asked her to lower the volume. She opened the door, and I quickly glanced inside the house, which had an unbearable smell. Her walls were covered in crosses painted with different colors, and words like Jesus and angels scribbled everywhere. The windows were all painted black, blocking out any light. There were soaked, yellowed, and stained carpets, dog feces, and cockroaches everywhere, rats on the old torn sofa. It was a real mess, even though there was apparently no dog. I asked her to lower the noise, but she just looked at me and closed the door. Then, she turned the radio up even louder. That old lady was very eerie. The next night, my girlfriend was sleeping over. I woke up in the middle of the night and saw the shadow of a person beside the bed, watching us sleep. I thought I was hallucinating, as I often do in the dark when I'm sleepy. But then, the shadow started speaking. It was my neighbor, holding something in her hand. She had broken into my house at night, and who knows how long she had been there. "You should lock your doors at night," she said, and left. The next morning, I heard strange noises beneath my bedroom window. It was my neighbor talking to herself, holding a plastic bag with her dead and decomposing dog inside. It was scorching outside, and you could smell death coming from that bag. At this point, I was terrified. It was obvious she was completely insane. That woman was beyond crazy. I went upstairs and knocked on another resident's door to ask what the hell was going on. The guy was as scared as I was. Apparently, she had broken into his apartment one night while he was watching TV with his kids. He got up from the couch to grab a snack and found her behind the sofa, staring at him and holding an electric drill. Thinking back now, I know what she had in her hand. At this point, I was basically shitting myself with fear. I called the police, and they already knew about her. Apparently, she had violent schizophrenia and wasn't taking her meds, but they couldn't force her to take them or enter her apartment without permission because she was the owner. The only thing they could do was pick her up when she went out on the street. I spent the next 2 nights awake, waiting for her to run out of cigarettes. When I heard her leave at 2 in the morning to go to the convenience store on the corner, I quickly called the police. 3 cars and a special van arrived in less than 2 minutes. They subdued her and threw her into the van and headed for some institution. And in less than a minute, it seemed like she was never there. I never saw her again, but I still have nightmares about her watching me while I sleep. This happened when my fiancé and I moved into our house together in a quiet little town. We still live in this house. It's a modest and cute house, perfect for us and some children when we decide to have them. We met one of the neighbors right away. They seemed friendly, an older couple in their 60s. The neighbors on the other side were far away, so we didn't meet them for a while. We were still in the unpacking and furnishing phase. Maybe it was in the 2nd week of living in the house. We were exhausted every night, having to work at our jobs and then also tidy up the house and unload. Julia was cooking pasta in the kitchen. I was sitting at the table talking to her while on my laptop buying a plant pot for the area. It was a bit stuffy in the house, so I was going to open the back door, but when I got there, I looked out into the yard and saw someone sitting in one of the chairs. He was kind of hunched over, with his head down. When I say I almost crapped myself in fear when I saw him, I'm not kidding. I whispered Julia's name and told her not to scream, but that there was a man in the yard. She went over to look. She grabbed me and hid behind me and told me to go say something. To be honest, I didn't even know if I should go outside or not. I'm not a very brave man, to be honest, And even though this guy was sitting with his back to us, he seemed bigger than me. Julia suggested I tap on the glass and shout for him to leave. I didn't want to do that. I was scared. The yard is huge, but right in front of the back door is a patio with leftover furniture. The yard lights weren't on. We only saw him from the interior light passing through the glass door, which meant he knew we were home. I said screw it, tapped on the glass and yelled, "Hey, you need to get off our property." The man turned and looked at me. He then stood up with a half smile, almost as if he were laughing. He looked to be about 40 years old. He was bald and had sinister tattoos all the way to his wrists. He walked up to the glass. I made sure the door was locked. He stood on the other side of the glass door and shifted his gaze to Julia. He began licking his lips and saying disgusting things. I yelled, "Okay, I'm calling the police." I closed the sliding curtain to get him out of our sight. I called 911 and asked the operator to please send the police to our house. I could still hear the man on the other side of the door, now speaking in a very loud volume, almost yelling, still saying repulsive things about my wife. I put the phone against the glass for the operator to hear. She made me stay on the phone until the police arrived. Eventually, it quieted down outside, and then I peeked through the glass, and the guy was gone. Still, I couldn't wait for the police to arrive, and when they did, they searched the yard. We filed a police report, and the officers left. We thought it was over, but later that night, when we were in the living room watching Netflix, we both agreed that we heard something outside, in the yard. I went to the window and opened it just a little to see the man again outside. He had a cigarette in his hand. He was talking to himself, or trying to talk to us, looking at the house. He noticed the opening in the blinds because he ran to the window. I jumped back, and he started banging on the glass. He was at the window, saying all these horrible and sick things he wanted to do to Julia. I told her to go upstairs. I didn't want her to hear any more of it. I yelled that I was going to call the police again, and then the punches stopped, and he went quiet. I gathered my courage and grabbed my sawed-off shotgun that my father had given me as a gift, loaded the gun, and went downstairs, and he was gone. I went back up to comfort my wife, who was visibly shaken. I told her he had gone away, but in hindsight, I should have dealt with it right away. Downstairs, I heard noises and knocks. I went halfway down the stairs and heard thuds on the back door and the doorknob turning. He was trying to get into the house. I grabbed the gun from the kitchen, and again, he had disappeared. It's very likely that he ran to the trees in the backyard. He didn't come back that night. The next day, we went knocking on neighbors' doors, introducing ourselves to those we hadn't met yet, and asking if they knew anyone matching that man's description. What we found out was disturbing. A few houses away knew that man. He was infamous for beating his ex-wife and having issues with alcohol and drugs, and was generally considered very dangerous. He lived on the same street as us, in a small, run-down house. That was the scariest part. We reported him to the police, but since we didn't have him on video, we couldn't prosecute him. We don't know if he still lives there because we haven't heard or seen him in a while. I hope it stays that way. I am a police officer in Massachusetts. I have been doing this since I was 25. Most of the time, it's not as exciting as it sounds. Not much happens in my county. Usually, the calls are disturbances or occasionally thefts, with something a bit more serious every now and then. I've worked almost every possible shift. I spent some time on the night shift, and there were definitely weirder calls at night than during the day. But there was this one time when I was working the night shift and didn't receive any calls. I was driving on a quiet road, no streetlights, with forests all around. I saw the reflection of taillights approaching quickly on the right side of the road, in the grass. As I got closer, I noticed that the driver's side door was open. I began to veer onto the grass, planning to stop and see if the driver needed help. I saw someone get out of the car, stand by the door for a second, and then start running into the forest. I radioed in the coordinates for a suspicious person or vehicle and got out of the car with the flashlight on and my hand on my gun, just as a precaution. In that situation, I had to expect the worst. I reached the front door of the car and looked inside, half expecting to see another person sitting there, but the car seemed empty. However, there was a terrible smell coming from inside the car, like that of a decaying animal. I called out towards the forest asking if anyone was there and needed help, while waving the flashlight. I returned to the car to take a closer look inside the passenger side, where there were several blood-soaked towels and papers. Towels on the passenger floor and also on the back seats were drenched in blood. The papers were completely dark red. At one point, as I was looking into the car, I heard footsteps in the woods. I turned with my flashlight and shouted, "Come out of the woods!" I didn't see anyone, but someone was hiding there, confirmed when I heard a deep voice coming from beyond the trees. I didn't know what the voice was saying, so I replied, "Show yourself. Are you injured?" As I prepared to draw my gun and approached. There was no response. The voice didn't sound like someone in pain. Moreover, why would someone run into the woods upon seeing a police cruiser? Something was very wrong. I went back to the car and called for backup. While investigating the car, I noticed it had no plates, and, upon searching the back seats, I found something that nearly made me vomit in shock. Something heavy, wrapped in blood-soaked paper towels. I unwrapped it with my gloves and found a piece of a human finger. There was also a piece of scalp. The situation went from concerning to urgent. I radioed that there was a possible murder and I needed backup. I turned on the lights of my cruiser to help other officers locate me. When backup arrived, we thoroughly searched the woods, but found no blood trails, which suggested that the hand and blood on the fabrics were not from the person I saw running into the woods. The K9 unit had to be called in, but hours and hours of searching yielded nothing. The vehicle was seized, reported stolen by a resident of a nearby town, who said he had no idea who could have stolen it. We collected fingerprints from the steering wheel and conducted DNA tests on the hand, but there was no match with anyone in the database. To this day, there has been no progress in figuring out who was driving that car and whose remains those were. I will never forget that night.